Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith, and this is my co-host, also Keith. Today, we will be talking about a movie that we watched that involved things. I was going for a bit. It didn't go as well as I was hoping for it to, so I do apologize, but, you know. There's a little bit of a dad joke in all of us waiting to get out. So every now and then I just have to sate that need, if you will. Hope you guys are doing well this week. This week we are talking about the movie Pi, which is a Darren Aronofsky flick. You might know Aronofsky from Requiem for a Dream or his more recent and very popular movie with Natalie Portman and Black Swan. Both of those movies I actually have not seen, which I think is a bummer. Pi is Aronofsky's directorial debut. It came out in 1998, and it stars Sean Gillette as a gentleman named Maximilian Cohen. Sean Gillette also helped to write the screenplay with Aronofsky, which I thought was a pretty cool little tidbit. The film synopsis is basically that there is a mathematician who believes that everything in the world can be predicted via a set of numbers, that there are patterns that exist in the world that can basically tell you what's going to happen when for pretty much everything. His main proposal is at first directed towards the stock market, but then is later directed towards religious beliefs and then kind of forced back into the realm of the stock market because of the plot of the film, which I'll be going over at least in some detail, and then also going to be talking about a lot of the philosophic ideas that are being portrayed in this film. It won a couple of awards. Definitely found it to be very entertaining. The writing and the dialogue were pretty straightforward. It did a good job of kind of like moving back and forth between like a psychological thriller and an action movie and a, like, I don't know, computer science techie movie. And if I'm being honest, when I first started watching it, I was like, okay, where's the sci-fi element to this? Because it was listed on, you know, best science fiction films to watch on Amazon Prime, which is why I originally watched it and wanted to share it with you all because, you know, a lot of us probably have an Amazon Prime subscription, especially right now, and I thought it would be good to pick a movie that was kind of interesting, and I've always wanted to watch an Aronofsky film, but this film is not very sci-fi-y. I am going to talk about it just because I didn't have anything else prepared for today, because I was fairly confident that if this was listed on a science fiction list, it would be very science fiction-y. As far as, like, the setting, it's pretty clearly in the 90s. Just stylistically, it feels very 90s. There's a lot of, like, the soundtrack sounds straight out of a 90s movie. The computers and the way that they're depicting them are straight out of a 90s movie. It definitely is not trying to portray like a future environment of any kind. There's some like kind of techie science fiction-y things to it. Like he has like a mechanism that can put medicine into his arm subcutaneously, which is pretty good, considering he needs that medicine. But I'm pretty sure that mechanism is not supposed to indicate that this is set in the future. All the cars are like 90s and older cars. And it feels kind of like a movie that, like, the concept was written in the 80s, and then someone finally decided to film it in the 90s, which is good. The movie is definitely good. It's just that, you know, when you go to watch something that's science fiction, even with my loose definition of, like, The Lobster as being science fiction, this is even less science fiction-y than The Lobster. So, you know, I do apologize for that. But it does kind of have this idea, the universal idea of alienus nova or nova alienus, the term that I'm, you know, working way too hard to coin on this podcast as being the thing that defines science fiction as science fiction, that being the presence of something called the new alien. And that can be a new alien in the form of knowledge or in the form of an organism. It can be a number of things. But the big and most important part of it is that it is the thing that drives the plot forward or changes the main character. And so there is a little bit of that in this film. I would definitely say that there's an argument to be made that this is kind of like a science fiction psychological thriller. But I would not necessarily slot this into, like, this is a science fiction film. So, you know, just letting you guys know in advance, this isn't quite as spaceshipy or futuristic-y as a normal science fiction movie would be. So I do apologize. But with all that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the movie. So the film starts out with some pretty standard exposition. Nothing super fancy here. Basically, we find out that the main character, Max, is an individual who suffers from some form of, I don't know if they're hallucinations, I don't know. And that's one of the nice things about this film, is that it's kind of hard to tell exactly what's real throughout the majority of it. Though there is a presumption that the stuff is actually happening. Some of it seems so outlandish that it is possible that it's all happening in this dude's head. And there's, you know, a bunch of indications of that throughout the film, so, you know, eventually we'll get through those. My favorite line, right? Eventually we'll get to it. So we get this exposition. The main character is introduced to us as kind of like a hermit with access to a supercomputer, and he's super smart, but also incredibly antisocial, and he is pursuing this specific mathematical equation to explain things in the world and the patterns that they, you know, not emit necessarily, but display, so that he can predict the stock market, which of course attracts the attention of individuals who are involved in the stock market and who have a lot of money invested in the stock market, which leads to its own slew of problems, which is to be expected in a movie like this. Though, what is kind of interesting about the film is that it seems like a lot of people in the public are aware of Max Cohen, even though he lives in a tiny apartment in Chinatown in New York. It doesn't really seem like he is the type of person to have been of notoriety at any point, though, like, the computer in his apartment obviously indicates that he has a lot of money. He's installed, I think it's like 5 or 6 different locks onto his door in his apartment, which is funny because most of them are chain locks, so I don't know, like, what exactly the purpose is, because when he leaves, he can only lock the one lock. So that's kind of funny. But regardless of that, yeah, it's definitely interesting that he is well known by all of these different individuals who are both in, like, the private industry and the theological community. We get pretty rapidly introduced to some people who have vested interests in what it is that Max is doing. Those individuals, the first one is very blatant in their interest. It's a woman named Marcy who works for a stockbroker company, or just a company that kind of speculates on the market, or at least does things in the market. There's some indication later on in the film that they have a substantial amount of sway over things in the stock market because they get part of this equation that Max has been working on, and it causes the market to crash, which is interesting because that means that the part of the equation was that the market would crash. So the equation in some capacity predicted that it would be, or that the people who wanted it would find it and then cause the market to crash, which is a whole nother thing. Which I guess, if we're going to talk about what the science fiction aspect of this movie is, there's this concept that gets introduced about halfway through the film where the computer that Max is using, or the numbers that Max is coming up with, are somehow aware of the world in some capacity because the pattern is so intrinsic to life itself. It has a certain amount of awareness included in it, because if someone were to find that pattern, then that would mean that it was in the pattern for them to find the pattern, which is kind of like the reductio ad nauseum or something like that. Reductio ad nauseum. It's the turtles all the way down idea, which is based off of a Native American creation story, which I will go over right after this quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Idea of reductio ad nauseum or something like that. I can't remember the Latin term for it. But there's a statement that some philosophers will use where they'll say it's turtles all the way down. And what that is referencing is this idea that I don't know if it was a Native American myth or it's some creation mythos where the world was carried out of the ocean by a turtle, but then where did the turtle come from? Well, it was carried on the back of another turtle, which was carried on the back of another turtle. And so basically it's just this idea that creation is this cyclical maybe not cyclical thing necessarily, but it's this idea that, like, there is no origin for anything. It just continues to be the same thing in repetition all the way down, which I think might be part of the reason why things that repeat and have patterns are so kind of like scary, but also beautiful in weird ways. Kind of like music. Music is a patterned medium of art where, you know, if you know music theory, things move in specific ways that are pleasurable to the ear based off of, like, you know, the way that harmony and melody works and the way that those idiosyncratic things happen when you're writing and playing and listening to music. And so, and also it's terrifying because of things like, you know, The Shining, where it says too much work makes Jack a dull boy, or all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Yeah. Then those like patterns of repetition are kind of scary because I think they speak to this deeper understanding of patterned things in the world around us. But anyway, that has nothing to do with this movie. I'll bring it back to the movie now. So Max starts out the film where he's kind of refining his approach to solving this issue, or this riddle, I guess, of what the specific set of numbers and patterns at the core of the existence of the world is/are. And he seems to be using a lot of different factors. Pi seems to be a super important number, hence the title of the movie. Apparently there's a 216-digit number in pi that exists somewhere in that, the equation of pi, or the number sequence of pi, that both Max and the teacher that we are introduced to throughout the film, they both have discovered this particular number. And the teacher says that the number is what caused his stroke, because the teacher used to be, it's indicated to us by Max that the teacher used to be a very famous mathematician who was working on like theoretical values in pi and patterning out those numbers, or looking for a pattern within the infinite number of digits in pi. And he eventually gets to this 216-digit long number that and when he gets there, he experiences a stroke and stops working on that particular project. And there's kind of this indication that there's something sinister at work in the fact that Max is even working on this project, which I found to be interesting because, well, okay, so the film, sorry, I don't mean to pause and be all like, but the film, I don't want to just summarize the film for you guys. I want to give you something interesting that maybe you didn't notice, or talk about the philosophy involved in it, or what makes good storytelling in the film, things that I noticed and things like that, because this isn't just a podcast where I just talk about content and summarize it for you. Like, I'm hoping that you'll be reading it with me, so there's at least some presumption that you have watched the film or are considering watching it. As with most things on this podcast, when I review something and when I talk about it, I definitely encourage you to talk or to watch it, despite the fact that I'll give away a lot of spoilers. Because most of the things that I choose, I am pretty picky about which spoilers it is that I give away. So you're definitely not getting everything when it comes to my summary. It's just, you know, I want to make sure that I'm giving enough exposition for everyone to be kind of on the same page with me. So anyway, all that out of the way. One of the main ideas in this film is that the numbers have some sort of consciousness to them, or the computer that the numbers develop from has some sort of consciousness to it. And it's kind of ambiguous as to whether or not the consciousness occurs within the computer or the consciousness occurs within the things outside of the computer. Because there is a lot of, like, when we get towards the end of the film, Max starts destroying the computer that he has set up in his room. It's like a very advanced supercomputer that he uses to try and like figure out if these equations are predictive enough to actually get the stock market numbers accurately. And he ends up destroying it, which to me kind of indicates that there might be an implication that he thinks that the computer is what is causing the problem. But there's also an indication that it might be that the numbers themselves, or he says specifically that the space between the numbers is what's more important than the numbers themselves, because this series of 216 numbers is like something that anybody could happen upon, but just because they happen upon that series of numbers doesn't mean that they'll understand it. And Max seems to have access to some special part of this set of numbers, which would imply that it definitely has the numbers in themselves have some sort of significance. And one interesting element that is introduced into this film, so there's two primary groups that are seeking out these numbers from Max. The first one is introduced to us as a private company that has been like watching him using miscellaneous forms of surveillance in order to try to get at some of the answers and the numbers and things that he has been coming up with, because they're interested in the fiscal implications of being able to completely predict the stock market long before it does anything in particular, which would kind of break the economic system. And I think what's interesting is that Max says that the stock market is in itself a living organism because it's managed by millions or billions, he says, of individual organisms, so it takes on a life of its own, which I do think is true in some capacity. Ultimately, the premise of the film is that because it is an organism itself, that it has a predictive nature to it that's based off of the patterns that are intrinsic into life itself, because it's run by an abundance of life. So all of the life that's contributed to it is what gives it its life of its own. And there is perhaps also a mirroring of that in the idea of these numbers being super important and having cognizance or consciousness of their own. A lot of this movie seems to kind of circle around like multiple ideas, and I'm sure it feels like I'm kind of bouncing around here and there on like different topics and different subjects, but that's just because this movie is pretty dense. It's only an hour and 20 minutes, but it definitely is an hour and 20 minutes of thought-provoking content, and I've just been kind of sifting through it for the last day or two, trying to make sure that I knew how to accurately depict everything within the hour, because I will probably have more material to talk about than what's in this hour, but I'm definitely not making this a two-parter. It's not quite that much material, but anyway, I'll keep talking about it right after this quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
I had kind of gone off on a random tangent, so let's get back on topic. I was mentioning the two main groups who are interested in the number sequence that Max is coming up with that is going to apparently predict everything that happens in the world, especially the stock market, and what the importance that those individuals have as far as like commentary and the plot are concerned. So the first individual is a woman who works for a company. I've already mentioned her. The second individual who seems to take a lot of interest into Max is a practicing Jew who, Lenny I think is his name if I'm remembering correctly, who is part of a specific sect of Judaism who have some particular practices that aren't necessarily, I think they are considered orthodox. I'm not super familiar with Judaism as a whole, so there's like some specific elements of ritual that, like, I'm not sure if they're traditional practices within that system of faith or if they're kind of like fictitious and specific to this sect of Judaism in the film. But we don't find out that the Jewish individual, Lenny, is really interested in the series of numbers or this algorithm until about 3/4 of the way through the film. And we get this backstory from the rabbi who is the leader of this group that Lenny is a part of, who tells the story of the sacking of the temple by the Romans. And he says that the original name for, or the real name of God is a 216 character long series of numbers, which happens to be the same amount of numbers that Max has found. When he first made the prediction that the market was going to crash, he was very surprised because a lot of the companies that he has been making predictions on and using for his pattern prediction, it was predicting that their numbers were going to be record lows. And that, to him, indicated that he had done something wrong and he was upset about it. Well, he also, at the end of that, gets a 216-digit long number that the computer prints out that he thinks is just like a bug or something weird. And when he goes to talk to his teacher about it, the teacher says the same thing, like, oh, when I was researching pi, I also got to a number that looked like it didn't fit with the rest of everything else. And so I just kind of stopped there. There's some indication that the number has a form of, well, maybe not the number, that the appearance of the number has some sort of ominous indication to it. But anyway, so he gets that number, has the printout, and throws it away in the trash can. And then after throwing it away in the trash can, everything comes true. All of the predictions of that day become true. And in part, because the implication is that the number or the computer has sentience or awareness of some sense, that would mean that it would have predicted based off of knowing that it would be discovered by an individual who was a part of this company that had that much sway over the stock market. And it would have had to include the knowledge of that in its prediction of what was going to occur within the stock market, which I think is really interesting as far as like a concept is concerned. So this is where I'm going to kind of talk about like the idea of why I ultimately still think that, despite the fact this really isn't a science fiction-y movie, it is a science fiction movie. I think that the alien in this film is this unseen force that acts in the world that is supposed to be either like God or the mind. There is some indication at the end of the film there's a specific interaction that Max has with either a metaphoric or a literal mind. He has this interaction with it 2 to 3 times throughout the film. Very surreal. Just fair warning, it is a little grotesque. But he has this interaction with it, and at the end of the film, there is this specific interaction that he has with his mind that indicates that he needs to lose a certain part of his mental capacity in order to gain a sense of normalcy in his life again. And there's a specifically targeted area on his skull that's based off of that kind of like, I wouldn't necessarily say, he has the diagram, it's a Renaissance diagram, I believe, of a man who has numbers drawn all over his face and his skull, and it's supposed to be like the Fibonacci sequence or something like that, and he has this specific spot on his head that appears throughout the film, and it seems to be causing him pain, and it also seems to come out of nowhere, which I found to be like suspicious. And another thing that kind of comes out of nowhere that, you know, I had mentioned earlier that it's kind of hard to tell if this film is really real, and like what in it is actually happening and what in it is fake. There is the presence of these like, they look like ants, but they somehow have like webbing, or they leave behind this secretion that causes like issues with Max's machinery, and that's one of the first things that happens after he gets to this 216-digit number, is that he has his server suspended, and like it's airtight except for like a couple of conduits that run through it in order to run cool air over the top of it so that it doesn't overheat, and it not surges. Yeah, I guess it surges because a connection is formed between, you know, two things that shouldn't be connected via the webbing or tissue left behind, secretion left behind by something that looks to be an ant, which I thought was interesting because, you know, it would have made sense if it was a spider, but it seems kind of like this weird creature that just happens to leave behind this odd residue. And it's not really indicated like what kind of creature it is. It's definitely a bug of some sort, so it's really ambiguous. They would have been better off with a spider, in my opinion, but hey, that's just my opinion. But anyway, there's some indication. I'm way off in the weeds with that discussion. I just realized how far off I was from my original topic. There's some indication that the mind is the thing that has mastery over the world around it, and that in part his mind is becoming aware of itself in the world in some capacity, and that he is gaining a certain level of power over the world around him because of his understanding of his own mind, and in order to reach enlightenment or to be rid of the curse of enlightenment, he needs to cease interaction with that particular part of his brain. And I would argue also that the teacher experienced the same thing in his research of pi, because he ultimately did find the same exact number that Max did, and he experienced a stroke after having that. And so he blames the number. He said the number gave me the stroke. And there is some indication that there's a similar thing that happens to Max after he realizes what it is that he's discovered. He has to cease interaction with that particular part of his brain in order for him to achieve some sort of inner peace, I guess would be the best way to phrase that. I'm not necessarily sure how I would want to go about handling that idea, but regardless, it's just very interesting that there seems to be this general theme of lacking control over the mind. Max is always taking drugs of some sort for a headache or it seems like he has seizures as well. So he's always taking anti-seizure medication, and it isn't until he starts to have these very specific and intentional interactions with his mental faculties that he gains a semblance of control over them. He lists off all of the treatments that he's tried in order to stop them, and even at the end of the film, it doesn't seem like he hasn't stopped them. They're still occurring, but he does kind of refuse to take his medication, and it ends up being the exact same way that it always has been, and it doesn't end up being that much worse than well, I guess that's not true. One of the final and most like pivotal points of the movie, the creepiest part of the movie, occurs in that last sequence after he refuses to take his medication in order to subdue his mind. So I'm going to keep talking about that right after this next quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
I was kind of talking about this idea of the mind being a terrible master. And this is something that's been pretty present in a lot of different, I don't know, not philosophical discussions, maybe metaphysical discussions would be the better way to categorize those particular things. It's just that there is this idea that, and I've talked about this on this podcast before, that there exists some capacity or something within your mind that interacts with the world in a subconscious way, and it imposes thoughts on you. The Cartesian issue would say that that's like a soul. Locke would probably say that that's just a part of your self, and that self comes from the cognitive function or the biological function of the mind. If you look at like neuroscience and things like that, there are a number of like, I don't even know, they're subconscious. Like we're so woefully unaware of these interactions that like there's no way for us to really get at them without some form of extreme mindfulness practices. But anyway, that aside, I think that that's something that Aronofsky is trying to portray pretty heavily in this film, is that when you kind of allow your mind to do whatever is that it wants to do without being mindful of it, that it's going to end up kind of owning you or running your life, and that is destructive because it's not a cognitive function, it's not a conscious function, it's a subconscious function that really is just not good for individuals. And I think that is like an interesting concept. There's a specific speech that's given by an individual named David Foster Wallace, which I'm sure I've mentioned on this podcast before. I would hope I have. It's one of my favorite pieces of, like, I don't know, it's one of my favorite, I guess you could call it an essay. But it's called This Is Water, and he makes the specific statement that the mind is a terrible master. And it's very clear throughout this film that Max has little to no control over his mind and where it takes him and what it makes him do. And it seems like it's really damaging him biologically. Like, he suffers from nosebleeds, he gets the migraines, he gets all these other things. There's this specific reference multiple times to this idea that as a child, his mother told him, don't stare directly at the sun. And so his natural response, of course, was to do that exact thing. And it caused him to become temporarily blind because he did it for so long. And there is, I think, this idea that there's like a subconscious, I guess, pernicious thing that's kind of always in the back of his head, or maybe not in the back of his head, literally in the front of his head. After you see the movie, that comment might make more sense. But there's this pernicious thing, this evil that exists to destroy him as an individual within his brain that he cannot seem to get control over. And I think that in the end, like, one of the big statements that this film is making is kind of like this idea that even having knowledge of the ways in which everything operates it includes the knowledge of knowing how you'll operate as well. It includes the ability to understand your own patterns and your own, inevitable pitfalls, and that knowledge in itself will also destroy you. Because I feel like the film kind of implies that having garnered the understanding, because at some point he does kind of crack this code. It's towards the end when he is confronted by the religious individuals who say, like, give us the number, and he says, like, it's just 216 numbers. Like, it's 216 digits. It's not even 216 individual numbers. It's 216 digits. And he makes the statement that, like, you as an individual or as a computer could run through all of the possible combinations within 216 different digits, and all of the different ways in which those could form numbers, and all of the potential, like, I guess, patterns or numeric values that could form within those 216 digits. You could run through all of them and try literally every single one pretty quickly, especially even in the 90s with computer technology. That's not something outside of the realm of what computers are capable of doing as, like, not necessarily a light task, but it is something that computers will do. So he makes that point, and that's the point at which he says, like, it's not the numbers themselves, it's the space, it's the thing that happens between the numbers that is of such great importance. The name of God isn't a 216 long character name. That's just a word, right? The true name of God that they say died with the individual who was killed during the sacking of the temple by the Romans. The thing that died was the knowledge that priest had of what happens in the word, of understanding the word. It's kind of like a commentary on humans' ability to get at the thing in itself, but specifically in a religious context. And there's, of course, some religious commentary about this idea that they think that they could understand it and it won't harm them because they're pure, and Max is clearly not pure because this number and the knowledge of this number is causing him physical harm. So he makes the point that, that they're not pure, and he's definitely right. Obviously, there's no such thing as a pure person. But I think that's kind of beside the point. That's like a tertiary point that Aronofsky is making in this whole idea. But ultimately, the knowledge of things and of patterns doesn't mean that you've surpassed anything in particular. It doesn't mean that you have achieved enlightenment. And I think that that's one of the big points of the film, is to say that, like, enlightenment is this thing that comes from self-awareness and control over the mind, and doesn't come from knowledge. It doesn't come from, like, oh, I have this number and I know exactly how it's supposed to work and I can predict everything. Well, it's like, no, now you can just predict everything. That doesn't mean that you understand anything. And so even when the company steals the original numbers out of a trash can because Max didn't realize what it was that he had found, they are the ones who caused the stock market crash. Well, the numbers are implied to have known that they would be found and that it would cause a stock market crash when they were found and used improperly. And Max thought that the 216 numbers were incomplete. And they kind of are in some capacity, but they also aren't. And I think that this is kind of a statement also on like our understanding of history, and I'm going to specifically comment on that right after this next quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello again, everybody. I'm trying to avoid saying already welcome back. I feel like I do that literally all the time in every episode, and it feels like a cop-out, you know? I really feel like I should be more creative with my returns from commercial break. So right before they break, I had mentioned this kind of idea. I don't know if I would say that I stumbled upon it while I was talking about it, but this idea of like understanding and getting at the thing in itself. So I don't know if Aronofsky is someone who is of Jewish descent or anything like that, but if you look at the history of Judaism, there is something, there's a particular aspect of Judaism that a lot of Western culture is not familiar with. And I learned this listening to a podcast about a gentleman named Maimonides, who is a Jewish theologian. He's an amazing theologian, and he did a book on philosophy, which of course inevitably had some religious content to it. So I highly recommend it. Maimonides is a very wise and insightful individual. He's very old philosopher. He's from I don't even know how long ago he was writing. So, but I really enjoyed what it was that he had to say. But in learning about him, there is this decided practice within Judaism that a lot of Western cultures are unaware of, and that is that Judaism is an oral as well as a written tradition. And so I'm not sure, again, if Aronofsky is a practicing Jew, then he probably is aware of this idea and aware of this kind of like juxtaposition of like, you know, the perception of things and the reality of things within Judaism specifically. Judaism has been a long misunderstood religious sect. There's the blood libel that came about in medieval times that people were persecuted for. There's the Holocaust and the fact that Jewish people were the only individuals whose religious beliefs allowed for them to participate in banking. There's a lot of things in Judaism that are just generally like misunderstood. There's just a lot in that religious belief sect that kind of falls in this weird area of like mysticism and religious practice and spiritualism and things like that we as a Western culture are just woefully unfamiliar with, because the majority of our culture has been based off of these like Christianized versions of Jewish people, because Judeo-Christian is like our kind of like the decided, I don't know, ancestry of our spiritual beliefs, if you will. So I think that there's potential that Aronofsky is making this commentary that there is a line that divides specifically an understanding of Judaism on a real level, where you are aware of the oral tradition that accompanies the written tradition, and the line where you're not aware of those things, so you think something is the way that it is, but it really isn't. But regardless of if he's commentating specifically on Judaism and the perception of Judaism in the Western world, it's pretty obvious that a lot of this movie is, I guess, it's rooted in this idea of the juxtaposition between perception and reality. Because towards the end of the movie, we get this I guess it is at the very end of the movie, we get this very specific scene that if it happened, then there's no way that the movie would end the way in which it does. And so the fact that we get this penultimate scene, because it is kind of like the second to last scene, we get this penultimate scene where the character has a specific interaction with himself that if it were to have occurred, then there's no way that he would be able to interact with the world again. And yet the last scene is him interacting with someone that we meet earlier on in the film. So it kind of forces us to challenge, like, well, what part of this movie was real and which parts of it were not real, and which parts are important for being real in order for this story to have some sort of modicum of truth about it. Because if it's kind of like these numbers, right? And the movie is like a commentary on itself, really, because of this idea of like numbers and things. Like, is something the sum or the whole? Is something the whole sum of its parts? Is the whole the sum of its parts? Sorry, I don't know why I'm stumbling over words so much today. Is the whole the sum of its parts, or is it just kind of arbitrary the way that we get there? Then there's this specific interaction that the math teacher and Max have, where the teacher says, if you think that you've found this pattern and you believe the pattern to be true, then when you go to interact with anything in the world, you'll see the pattern. Because your brain has a desire to impose pattern on the world. And I've talked about this idea before in psychology of the confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is this thing that your brain does because it has an evolutionary proclivity or an evolutionary prerogative to tell you that your perception of things is real. Because if your perceptions of things are real, then you as an individual have increased the likelihood of your survival and of your ability to reproduce and perpetuate your existence. So this applies to things that are conceptual as well. It's not just concrete things like I saw a lion in the grass. It is like, my money will do this. If you believe that your money will do this, then your brain will try to tell you that money operates in this specific way and that you as an individual will experience more or less success based off of the operation of your money in the world. That's part of why we have these patterns of like poverty and wealth, because individuals who are impoverished behave with their money in a specific way based off of the place that they were born in, which is happenstantial. So I'm not trying to say that that wealth or poverty are things that are brought on by individuals. I'm saying that they are perpetuated by specific behaviors, and that your proclivity for those behaviors is based on the happenstantial the happenstantial place and conditions of your birth, and not necessarily of like your own volition. Like a homeless person on a street most likely didn't do that to themselves. If we're looking at it just kind of objectively, we're told to avoid politics on here, so I'm just making sure everybody knows I am being truly neutral about this subject, just trying to state some logical facts about the proclivities of human beings and the behaviors that we have as individuals. And the reason I'm specifically citing income level is because there was a study that was done called the marshmallow test, where they basically put a marshmallow in front of a child and told them, you'll get 2 marshmallows if you wait. If you eat this one, then you don't get any more marshmallows and you're done. And they did this like 15-year-long study on these kids, and they found that the kids that waited for the second marshmallow performed better in all sorts of other areas, especially economically, as far as their proclivity for economic success. And there is this rampant, I don't know if I want to call it a disaster necessarily, but problem in psychology where they are having a replication crisis, where all these studies that they were presenting as axiomatic fact, the marshmallow study being one of these, they've tried to replicate these studies and they keep on getting different results, which means that ultimately the principles that that they're operating on are not really scientific. They are conjecture at best. Not that all science isn't conjecture, really, because ultimately science exists to be proven wrong by more science. But in the area of psychology, because it is kind of like a soft science, it's not like engineering or physics or chemistry. It becomes even more unpredictable because of all of the numerous contributing factors that happen within psychological studies. And so these people are having issues replicating the original results of the marshmallow test, which means that the original marshmallow test was flawed in some capacity. And I'm going to go over how it was flawed and why that is all pertinent to the statements that I'm making and pertinent to this movie right after this last quick commercial break.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back, everybody. So right before the break, I was talking about this marshmallow test thing that I'm sure some of you are aware of, some of you aren't. Had gone over the parameters of the test and the fact that there's like a replication crisis currently in the field of psychology. So what they're finding is when they've replicated this test that the children who don't or who eat the marshmallow faster, who can't wait for another marshmallow, often come from lower income households where the presence of food or the presence of resources is not guaranteed. And so what they found is that something that has kind of been affirmed just if you look at society in general, wealth begets wealth, poverty begets poverty, and these things exist in cycles because individuals learn specific habits and specific ideas about things that will give them a proclivity towards something, and that could be like the acquisition and the maintenance of wealth, or it could also be other things, of course. So that is kind of like speaking to this idea of like perception versus reality and like understanding versus knowledge, and that is a heavy theme in this film. Specifically in the scene where Max gets kind of like, I guess, confronted, is for lack of a better term, by the religious individuals towards the end of the film, and they're demanding the number from him because they believe that it's the true name of God, and they want to like relinquish him of the responsibility of having possession of it. And he says that like to you it would just be a string of numbers, and to me it means something because it was given to me. And that, I think, you know, if this whole situation is actually happening in some capacity, which we're not totally sure that it is, which is like a classic Aronofsky thing, to my knowledge. Again, I haven't seen Black Swan, so that's kind of like, you know, that's baseless conjecture on my part, but from what I've heard, he's very surrealist, and he always is kind of challenging, like, well, is this thing really happening, or is this a figment of this individual's imagination? But, you know, the perception versus reality idea is something that runs very heavy as a theme in this film. And I think that that's a really interesting theme to explore that's been done very well. And to use this idea of this alien, I guess you could call it sinister, this alien sinister thing that exists in the form of abstract knowledge, to use that as the alien is a pretty interesting storytelling mechanic, in my opinion, because oftentimes it's easy for us to say, like, well, this is the alien. It's this green, tall thing with big eyes and no nose and no discernible reproductive organs. Like, that's easy. That seems kind of like a cop-out. But to do kind of like the Jaws thing, where it's this monster that we never really see and we only get glimpses of, but we know that it's real because of its interactions with the world. to be able to execute that in a way that feels so visceral and so meaningful it's just a quality of an excellent storyteller, in my opinion, which Aronofsky absolutely does a great job in this film of using that as a mechanic, which that is kind of like my argument as to why this could even be remotely considered a science fiction film. Again, it's not necessarily futuristic or anything like that, but this omnipresent thing of like this sinister force in the world that is brought about by the knowledge of it is really an interesting statement on like the human psyche and on society and on individuals, which is kind of the same as the human psyche. But the fact that like all of these negative things and all of the like worst parts of the movie happen because of the knowledge that Max acquires is just really interesting to me, because ultimately it kind of says to me that like enlightenment can be just as damaging as ignorance if you're not wielding it properly. And if that enlightenment comes at, like, what is the cost of enlightenment? And I think that that's something that could easily be missed when it comes to this film, because it has this like cheesy 90s action soundtrack and like a couple like running chase scenes and some very interesting camera angles and like a lot of things to kind of obscure this like very blatant commentary on what is the cost of knowledge. And that is a theme that I think is not explored enough in science fiction in general. Oftentimes it's just kind of like, what are the consequences of new knowledge? But because there's a definitive economic interaction between the knowledge that Max acquires and the the knowledge that Max acquires and what it is that he's trying to, or the original method of his, or reasoning behind his desire to acquire it, that being that he wants to predict the stock market. There's a decided presence of an economic exchange here where we have this idea of like a literal money cost of what an idea is worth. And one of the biggest conflicts that Max has to deal with aside from the one within his own mind, is the conflict that he has to deal with the other individuals who are seeking out the number from him for their own selfish reasons. And the people from the company are seeking it out to make more money. And so in that case, the cost of knowledge has an economic cost and it has an economic benefit to an individual. But at what cost is he willing to acquire it or sell it? And then the religious individuals who are seeking it out, it's kind of a similar commentary, but in a more spiritual way. You know, like, what is the cost? Like, is the cost of knowledge your soul? Is the cost of enlightenment your body? Are you going to lose some aspect of your humanity because of your acquisition of this knowledge? And is that worth it to you in the end? Because it's not as if you lose your humanity in a way that precludes you from suffering with humanity. The knowledge explicitly just basically says, like, well, now you know everything that's going to happen, including what's going to happen to you, and it's still going to happen to you. And I think that that is something that's really interesting, because in order for the main character Max to kind of like rise above or overcome this issue, he has to relinquish his understanding of the knowledge, or his ability to understand a specific aspect of the world around him. At the end of the film, it kind of seems like he doesn't have a capacity for math any longer, and at the beginning of the film, it's like all he has a capacity for. So I'm interested in that transition and potentially like thinking about that more. But I don't think that Aronofsky really gives us enough breathing room throughout the film to include that as an important idea. I think that the biggest thing that this film is trying to say, the biggest, like the top three, you know, what is the difference between perception and reality? What is the difference between knowledge and understanding? And what is the cost of that knowledge or the cost of that understanding on individuals and on society as a whole? And that's a lot to say in just an hour and 20 minutes. This film definitely is dense. I really enjoyed it. I do highly recommend it. It's on Amazon Prime. You have to sign up for like a month-long free trial of a little channel called Movie Sphere, which I don't know why Amazon has like all these tiny little channels. Well, I know why, because they want to make money. But regardless, I'm not here to comment on consumer-based or capitalist-based ideas. I'm here to talk about science fiction. So, you can sign up and then cancel. Not that I'm encouraging that. There are some other good movies on that channel, so check that out. It's cheap to rent as well. So that's all I've got for you guys this week. I really appreciate you joining me. On Sunday, we'll be talking about Hyperion, the third chapter, the third tale, which should be really enjoyable. I am personally really thrilled to be getting to the next tale. I've enjoyed every chapter so far. So if you haven't started reading Hyperion yet and you want to participate in those podcasts, then I recommend it. Pick it for your book of the month with Audible, or purchase it on Audible or anywhere else, or just read the book. It's not that expensive to buy a paperback copy. I think it's like $7 or $8. So definitely worth it if you have the ability to set aside the time to read it. I did not, unfortunately. Even in this weird COVID-19 shelter-in-place stuff, I have a regular 9-to-5 that I got to work, so I'm doing that remotely. So anyway, everybody, I hope you have a safe week. Leave us a review, like us, follow us, subscribe, add us on Twitter. Definitely appreciate you listening to the podcast. Thank you so much, and have a great day, night, morning, whatever time you listen to this. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.